Hi guys, this is Andy McDonald from the Informed Performance podcast. On today's show, I have strength and conditioning coach, educator, and velocity-based training expert, Chris Toombs. Chris is very experienced as a coach, especially within the realms of power-based sports, and speaks very open and honestly about all things velocity-based training and strength and conditioning as a whole. Get episodes as soon as they are released and subscribe to us on iTunes or your preferred podcast player. And don't forget to check us out on Instagram at Inform Performance or on Twitter at InformPod. Now for the conversation with Chris. I hope you all enjoy it. Chris Toombs, welcome to the show, mate. I'm really glad to get you on here today.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate being invited.
Just to kick off, could you tell the listeners a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so do you want the short version or do you want the long version? I mean, I've basically been involved in the fitness industry and strength and conditioning for around, not counting, but I think it's 24, 25 years. Studied human movement studies and sport and exercise science at Leeds Metropolitan University in England, which is now Leeds Beckett. And from there, basically took a journey to London to basically be a PT and to work in the private sector. And a speculative application back in 2002 saw me go to Leicester Tigers, the professional rugby team in England. And lucky enough to work with those guys when England won the World Cup last. And from there, went to Cardiff Blues and worked for the Cardiff Blues for 9 years in various roles, mostly around basically strength and power prescription in the first team and also some athletic development work in the academy. So quite a diverse role. What was that? So that's 11 years in professional rugby. Took a little turn and a little detour to America. My wife's American, so I've got a green card, and I went to work for an American company that were looking to develop rugby in North America, and they just sat just underneath the sort of USA Rugby banner, and I had a lot of exposure to some sevens athletes, one of whom went to the Rio Olympics in 2016. So that was a quite nice coaching moment for me. Bounced back across the pond to England and worked in an English cricket team for 1 year. Transitioned out of that into academia, and I currently work at the University of South Wales lecturing in strength and conditioning, and I do a kind of consultancy role and a mentoring role at one of the semi-professional rugby teams. And just, I guess, breaking news, I am now returning to the USA in 2020 to work in Major League Rugby in the professional rugby team, the Seattle Seawolves. So that's kind of the 25 years in a nutshell.
And will you be coaching full-time in Seattle, or will you be kind of consulting?
Yeah, so back coaching full time. So yeah, another coaching opportunity for me, which is great. I won't lie to you, I've missed that full time coaching role over the last 2 or 3 years. So really excited to immerse myself back into coaching full time and seeing where Major League Rugby can progress in the next sort of 5-6 years, I hope.
You obviously, you lecture, you present on velocity-based training, and you've coached a lot. You've obviously got your ear to the ground. What do you think strength coaches are doing well at the moment, and where does the profession need to perhaps focus a bit more?
Interesting question. Yeah, this one could be quite fun. I guess the challenge is the comfort blanket that most people that I've come across in my kind of time as a coach, and also someone who's sort of interviewed and employed young coaches, their comfort zone is without a shadow of a doubt the gym.
Yeah.
And the sort of strength and power elements and the delivery of those kind of services. And then when you come to the sort of field-based, especially in team sport, which is kind of the domain that I've largely been involved in, when it comes to delivering on field and in large numbers, the coaches are way less more competent. So in terms of managing people, managing large numbers, and also managing to some degree the actual volumes and intensities required to sort of provide the adaptation mechanism, or at least the stimulus for that adaptation mechanism. Those are the things that they really struggle with and they're slightly less confident in. You one-on-one in the gym is relatively easy. You look at a forward pack in rugby or a bunch of backs that 10 or 12 of them. It's much more difficult to sort of manage the people as opposed to manage the actual content. So I think that'd be an area that I've seen probably over the last 15 years or so, and it's not necessarily changing anytime soon. I think that's one of the focus areas for, educators moving forward, would be take the emphasis away from the comfort zone of the gym and add some layers of exposure to that field-based work. And I think that's going to differentiate the best coaches from the also-rans.
Yeah, that's really valuable. And I'm guessing you've mentioned the educators need to focus on that. And I guess up-and-coming coaches need to get more coaching time with that in mind.
Absolutely. I think that's a key. And then that's one of the kind of stresses from us, especially at USW, would be that some of the people that we've spoken to in industry particularly are looking for the coach first and the academic second. And I think that's something that's to worth thinking about as well. And especially getting as much coaching exposure as possible at every level. And I think that's one of the big challenges we've got as educators and as slightly more kind of senior coaches, is to really encourage young coaches to volunteer. I know it's difficult. Everyone wants to get to the top jobs as quickly as possible. But one of the fastest ways to, like I say, steal a march on your competition is to get out there in your undergraduate studies and coach as much as you can alongside your kind of theoretical learning and your application alongside it. And
you're very well known for educating and using velocity-based training. I'm curious, how did you initially get into that? Not as a teacher, but as just as a training tool.
Yeah. So I guess, you've got to rewind yourself back to the sort of Leicester Tigers days, where there was a lot of fairly decent players at that time, and the kind of close alliance with, I guess, the England national program. And one day, I think Leicester Tigers took delivery of some Tendo units or some GymAware units. I can't remember exactly which brand it was. But we started messing around, I guess, in sort of pre-World Cup 2003. Just working and looking at velocity-based training at that point in time, and sort of looking at how we could best optimize the players' preparation. And from that sort of moment on, I kind of immersed myself in, developing strength and power in the gym, using, or at least helping integrate velocity-based technology into that process. And I guess from that point of view, that's where kind of my evolution started, when it came to, like I say, using technology to optimize the strength training process, and then, subsequently lend itself well to actually now delivering workshops in that sort of focal area. It's not that new in the grand scheme of physical preparation. I think, Dan Baker, who's probably one of the preeminent users of the tech, is kind of been using the stuff since the 90s. I think I'm using the tech, or have used the tech, since the early 2000s, and now it's becoming much more mainstream with its accessibility to, personal training markets, performance training markets. The devices that are being, developed at this point in time are becoming that little bit cheaper than when I first started. And, you're talking about buying a GymAware unit or a Tendo unit for about £2,000. Now you're buying technologies that kind of come in at £250 or $350. So it's accessible to more people, which I guess means there's access to more people using it, which is great for me, because all we want to do, I guess, as practitioners, is offer the best possible service to our athlete populations. And that's just one of the tools that can help us just be a little bit better at delivering high quality provision. So I guess it's not the catch-all, but it's also an important element to, I guess, layer training units on top of each other. And I know we can go into that a little bit more as we go, but it's like I say, I guess the best definition for me is it's optimizing the training process through the help of technology, not exclusively because of the technology.
And I'm optimistic that the strength and conditioning listeners will be very aware of velocity-based training. Just in case there's some physios or some kind of wider performance personnel that are less familiar with it, could you kind of succinctly just explain the basics of what it is and why it's important?
I guess as briefly as possible. Velocity-based training is ultimately the use of technology to help inform your decision making around prescription of load. It's about prescription of readiness. There's multiple uses, I guess, and it's one of those things that we can go off on a tangent, or we can talk for hours on, what it is and how many uses it's actually got. But I think in a nutshell, it's kind of the integration of technology to manage readiness and to manage, like I say, the process of training in terms of prescription and volumes, and getting the intensities right when it comes to either an acute dose of strength training, or longitudinally the sort of layering of doses on top of each other.
And there's systems that anchor to the floor, or squat rack or cage, and there's systems that you can wear, and there's also camera-based systems as well. How well do these different tools, if you like, calibrate with each other?
I think there's a fair bit. Funnily enough, there's a fair bit of research going on in that area at the moment. I think you've got, the USW and my own kind of research curiosities guiding me in that direction right now, actually, as it happens. But to answer your question, the linear position transducer, which is the tethered unit, so the gym aware and the tendo unit, predominantly the most popular two. They actually align pretty closely, and you've also got then the accelerometers like push bands, and you've got the camera systems like Elite Form, for example. There seems to be a little bit of difference between sort of the three methods, but ultimately I think that the challenge we've got as practitioners is that if you are using a linear position transducer, and then you've also got access to, say, something like an accelerometer, like a push band, is just to not kind of muddle and get some noise alternating between units. It's to use the same one and then use that as your guiding mechanism, as opposed to bouncing between the technologies. I'm fortunate that I've got 4 or 5 different VBT technologies in the training building that I use, but that's because of my interest in those technologies. But also, I'm just recognizing that if I use a push band to do sessions with a certain athlete population, I'll continue to use them. And I had extensive exposure to tendo units versus gym aware units, for example. So I'm much more comfortable in sort of recognizing what looks accurate even to the naked eye between devices. But I think that's a fair bit of coach intuition over sort of 15 or 16 years of exposure to the tech.
And, without you kind of saying which brand you think people should pick, if say a team or an athlete wants to implement velocity-based training, do you look at what type of movement patterns they want to measure before you then recommend, for instance, what type of system they would integrate, whether it's an accelerometer or whether it's, a tethered system?
There's lots of, it's one of those it depends moments. I think the reality, it's about constraints, and ultimately the constraint normally falls on finance. So the accelerometers are much more cost effective, and the tethered units are generally a bit more expensive. So I guess the question is going to be, in terms of finances, how much are you prepared to spend? How much do you want to spend? How much have you got to spend? And then there's also the portability. So I've got friends who use the push band, for example, and I have affiliation to them. I'll put that in as a disclaimer right now. They're so portable. I'm thinking about, I can't carry my tendo unit through customs, for example, in 2 months' time when I go to Seattle, because without being too controversial, it looks like a pipe bomb. So the reality is that the push band is the size of 2 matchboxes, and it's pretty portable, and it's also it's a pretty accurate and valid and reliable system. So I guess it's about functionality that you want for it. It's about cost effectiveness. It's about what other scope of practice and what other technologies you may or may not have access to within your performance program. So I think there's a lot of questions to ask, but I've had a lot of personal satisfaction using the tendo unit, and I've had a lot of personal satisfaction using the push band and the push band 2.0, and the evolution of the accelerometry in the technology is making those kind of things much, much more user friendly. They've all got apps now associated with either the iPhone or the Android phones, and in terms of the user interface and the user experience, I think all of the relevant technologies are becoming that much user friendly, or more user friendly, which is inevitably what the end user wants. It's, can I just plug in and play with this technology? And the answer's probably yes with all of them. So I guess that's a bit of a fluffy answer, but there's a fair few. It depends, I guess, within that scenario.
No, it's good to get some context on it. You can obviously use these devices to prescribe perhaps a more accurate load. How do you kind of use them to monitor and influence load management, which is obviously a huge topic everybody's talking about a lot at the moment?
Yeah, so I guess, again, it goes back to what other technologies and what other personnel have you got within your performance environment that may or may not help you inform your decision making on an athlete's readiness to train. But having something like a velocity-based training device in your strength and power-based training sessions, for example, I start at the very start with probably an unloaded dowel or very light PVC pipe for an unloaded counter movement jump, and just track the athlete's peak velocity using basically a jump squat counter movement jump, and just track that over time and look at the peak scores on that particular metric, and just see where they lie on a day-to-day basis, and where that longitudinally will allow you to make some informed decision making on the athlete's sort of central nervous system and their neuromuscular fatigue levels. Readiness to train can be a good guide from that. The secondary part of that would be to use the technology to actually profile athletes across the full force velocity curve. So you've got speed strength at one end, you've got maximum strength at the other, and you're going to basically build a plot line between how fast they're moving low loads and how fast they're moving, obviously, their loads at the heavier end of the spectrum. And surprise, surprise, there's pretty much a sort of linear regression of R equals 1 between lifting heavy things slowly and lifting light things quickly, and everything else in between. And from that, you're then in a position to, on a week by week basis, you're in a position to look at, for example, fixed loads during warm-up sets, to see where people's kind of velocities are with fixed loads, and see whether you need to then adjust either up or down depending on that athlete's, like I say, physical preparedness for the day. If you think about people like Brian Mann doing some really, really good work in this space around sort of physiological readiness, on any given day you're looking at potentially an 18% swing in 1 rep max. So that 1 rep max is always moving, and on any given day, depending on lots of different variables, you're either in a good place to lift heavy or to lift fast, or you're not. And I guess you can make those decisions based off your longitudinal data and your trend analysis on what certain athletes are doing with a fixed load on a week-to-week, month-to-month, even cycle-to-cycle basis. So that's the kind of major uses at the start of sessions. And then I guess you're then using it between sets, and you're using it as a kind of initial start point for the quality of your prescription set by set. And I think that's one of the best things about velocity-based training, as far as I'm concerned, is that you can actually micromanage the quality of each and every set depending on your training goals. And basically, you are looking to protect your athletes from themselves at times, and you're not wanting to take them too near failure from a technical standpoint. But also, inevitably, if you're getting guys missing lifts, then there's that kind of carryover of central nervous system stress that you don't really want to kind of continually overload to a point where they either overreach or they end up getting injured or they end up getting ill. So I think there's a nice buffer using VBT and understanding the velocity zones of what physical quality, strength quality particularly, you're trying to develop. If you know what the sort of bandwidth is for bar speeds, you can then literally always protect their athlete from themselves. And also, I think the major benefit for me is that if you protect an athlete from themselves in an acute sense, then in the terms of a sort of more chronic accumulation of load sense, you can actually get them to do more work over a longer period of time, because you've kind of just held them back a little bit session by session. But in the longitudinal sense, they'll get more out of that whole training program as a whole.
Yeah, so you can kind of cook them rare and microdose them over time.
There's no point trashing an athlete. If, say, for example, you're asking someone, an easy example, you're asking someone to do a 5x5 at 85% of 1 rep max. On any given day, 5x5 at 85%, it might be 90 something percent of 1 rep max, or it might be 70% of 1 rep max. So on those days where that athlete is physically prepared and ready to go, give them the 5x5 and maximize that potential stimulus that you're providing. There's going to be days when you've got to modify that based off some of the velocity scores you're seeing. And like you say, rather than making them grind at 5x5, you might just strip some of the volume out. It might be a 5x3 day. It might be a 5x2 day. And it might be that intervention is going to allow you to just add these training units up against each other, versus just, like you say, just cooking them well done and then coming back on the following training session and being unable to complete the reps and sets that you've asked them to do. So it's about making judgments and providing interventions based off that objectivity that you're seeing in terms of how fast and how much intent those athletes are putting into those reps when you're giving them a sort of objective feedback marker as well, which is another real major benefit for me, that you're actually seeing athletes giving you really high quality effort, because every single rep has some level of accountability on it with what sort of numbers you're asking them to achieve, and that's kind of linked in with effort for me. And obviously then you can do some sort of subjective marker alongside it, like a session RP or even a set by set RP, depending on how much time you've got to kind of record keep and track various data points.
Yeah. Well, something I was quite interested about is, if you're quite close to this, if you're force profiling an athlete on a force plate, you get a display and some information on, say, the eccentric and the concentric phase of a motion. Can a velocity-based system give you that information as well, or is it giving you total time for a repetition?
It's concentric only is the kind of the metric at the moment. There are some of the systems that will do some of the eccentric rate of force development stuff as well, but for the most part, these devices are looking at peak velocity, is looking at the fastest moment in time, and it depends on the system, but it can be as low as the fastest point or whatever 1 millisecond within the rep range, and then obviously the mean score is the mean of the whole of the concentric range of motion.
Yeah. And, I'm aware that you've toured a lot of facilities and you get around the strength and conditioning community. Is there any really good or really innovative examples of how people have implemented velocity-based training into their coaching or their environment that you've seen?
I think for the most part, this is a pretty vanilla answer, unfortunately. I think most of the people are really just dialing down into the high quality compound exercises. They're not doing anything too innovative, too fancy. It's just literally maximizing that training stimulus in the time that they've got available with their athletes. And that's what is kind of the common theme that I'm picking up across the teams that I've obviously seen. And I guess if you can call it innovation, I guess it's just about doing the basics really, really well. And I think the best teams that I've seen operationally use VBT are the guys who are managing the athletes' loads really, really well. And I think they're managing the kind of the readiness and preparedness kind of equation really, really well within their programs by almost taking their foot off the gas at the right times and putting their foot on the gas at the right time, so that actually the sort of longitudinal benefit is coming out with guys being in the best possible shape to perform week in, week out in their sort of competitive demands.
Yeah. With a physio hat on, I'm optimistic there's a segue to kind of rehab. Have you seen any physio departments implementing velocity-based training in their return to play monitoring and processes?
I haven't seen any physios in that respect yet, which is something that this is a good conversation for me to stimulate a bit of thought around who in that sector may want to come and actually learn a bit more about this. I've had sort of personal trainers come on the workshops that I deliver, and I've obviously had a lot of strength and conditioning coaches. But yeah, the physios are an area where I need to explore it, to be honest. So I appreciate you giving me a nudge in that area. I guess it's a bit like everything, isn't it? You've got so much integration of technology, especially in performance sports teams that are professional in nature, that a lot of people are integrating GPS in return to play, for example. But absolutely, I mean, velocity-based training has its part to play in terms of tissue loading and tissue quality and tissue readiness to return back to high levels of sport without a shadow of a doubt. So it's certainly an area that can be focused on for future education without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, because I know, physios are now using force plates a lot in kind of quantifying and identifying what does an injured athlete need to achieve in that return to play process. And
sure,
that's historically been done on lower limb, and Ben Ashworth's been doing it on the shoulder more recently. But I guess velocity-based training, especially the wearables, are quite a convenient and easy way for a physio to kind of stick a device on someone and start to get some useful information in that process.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that's key. The reality is, again, it goes back to what I talked about briefly in terms of actually protecting athletes from themselves, but also then dosing appropriately when it comes to actually getting some volume into athletes so that they are actually getting the development of the physical qualities required to then, like you say, return to performance and return to their sport. So without a doubt, the objective markers and the numbers could really, really help when it comes to making good decisions when it comes to training prescription, particularly.
Yeah. Have you got any kind of courses coming up, or what have you got coming up in the pipeline that listeners should be aware of?
So I guess I'm quite fortunate that, like I say, I've been involved with this type of technology for going on 15 years, I guess. I think I've aligned with Push Bands and Dan Baker's VBT course, which has been built out of Toronto in Canada, where Push originates. And my kind of key educational kind of concerns and courses are a run out of the alignment with those two people and organizations. So, I haven't got any coming up in the near future because of my kind of changing circumstances regarding my new role. But we'll be, without a shadow of a doubt, looking at some stateside venues to deliver some VBT workshops come, January through June next year. And then, without doubt, between June and December of 2020, I'll be doing some more in the UK marketplace. But, Andrew, I've got to admit, I do thank you for stimulating some thought around integrating it with the physios and opening the marketplace up even wider. Appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem. And
it's brilliant.
What are your social media handles for people to follow your journey to the States and just keep up to date with you?
I'm very original, mate. I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram. I use Instagram slightly less, but actually I do promote the courses through that relatively heavily when I am in the kind of sales mode, I suppose. Chris Toombs 71, very original.
Cool. That's easy for people to for them to find. And is there any resources that you'd recommend people turn to at the moment? Anything that you're seeing trending or worth a look at?
In terms of the VBT space?
Or anything.
I mean, it's great that it's growing. I mean, like I say, I have got an affiliation with Push, and they've just literally today launched their Android app to enable you to use the Push Band with Android as well as Apple products. There's a ton of stuff going on. It's evolving. It is evolving. I think there's a couple of other Push competitors that are in the same kind of space price-wise. More and more, again, I think we touched on it briefly, more and more research is needed in this area to actually start to engage the majority of coaches to sort of, I guess, share the experiences of those who are slightly more in tune with how valuable this tech can be and how impactful the tech can be. And I think it should be an area of focus for a lot of coaches, especially with those who have kind of been exposed to sport coaches, particularly who train their players with relatively high volumes. It just allows you to make those really good decisions when it comes to actually how much volume is enough to drive that stimulus and adaptation process when it comes to how much do you really need to do in the gym today? And I think those are the kind of questions we need to ask ourselves as coaches. And sometimes it's about taking a bit of the content out of our programs. But if you do that, it does mean that every single rep can count. And if you're good at prescribing load off the back of velocity-based zones, you get the quality output that you need. And I think Harry Dorrell, who's based at Lincolnshire in the UK, has done some great work regarding basically doing half as much work using VBT, but getting the same output. And I think that just allows the player, especially if you're talking about it from a team sport perspective, it allows the player to work more on their weaknesses or develop their skills outside of the gym, which ultimately is going to have the transfer onto the gym, onto the field of play. And I think that's where, like I said at the front end of this podcast, that my own personal evolution has been about thinking a bit bigger than just sets and reps and strength and power. That was where I had my kind of most success, I guess. But I've also evolved to think about the player as a whole and not just as the player as an athlete. So I guess that's the kind of underlying take-home message for me. It's like every single piece of this jigsaw puzzle dovetails together to sort of get the outcome that you need.
I guess, load for load's sake is pointless. What you want is the actual loads that are giving you adaptation and a return.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's it. Return on investment, brilliant. And if you can do half the work and get the same level of result, why do the extra bit of work? Because it's just eating into your ability to recover and ability to then train again or play again the next day or the day after wherever your competitive schedule may sit. So that's kind of where we're at with it. But I think it's evolving. There's plenty of technologies that are being sold on the internet, as we both know. But Yeah, VBT has value without a shadow of a doubt, and it has versatility if you're limited with other technologies that you may or may not have available to you.
Well, Chris, thank you. Thanks so much for that masterclass on velocity-based training. I'm probably going to have to play that back a few times to myself to get some of those pearls of wisdom into my head. But yeah, I really appreciated that. It was a good conversation from you.
No problem. That's great. I appreciate you inviting me. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Chris for coming on the show and deconstructing VBT for us today. As usual, I'll include links to anyone or anything mentioned in our conversation, which you'll be able to find at informperformance.com. Thanks for listening to the Informed Performance podcast, and don't forget to follow us on social media or subscribe to the show to receive new episodes and regular updates.